The static-filled audio of the 911 dispatch pierces the humid night air of Lonoke County, Arkansas, reporting a high-speed chase turning deadly. Grainy dashcam footage records the frantic acceleration of sheriff's deputies navigating winding rural roads, their sirens wailing against the darkness of October 2022. Upon arrival, the headlights reveal a chaotic scene of twisted metal and shattered glass, where Aaron Spencer stands over the lifeless body of 67-year-old Michael Fosler. To the responding officers, the physical evidence suggests a brutal homicide, but the immediate context reveals a nightmare scenario. Spencer, a local mechanic and dedicated father, had just intercepted Fosler in the act of abducting his 14-year-old daughter. Fosler was no stranger to the family. He was a known predator out on bond, awaiting trial for previously raping the very girl he had just snatched from her home in violation of a no-contact order. As deputies secure the weapon and approach the distraught father, the narrative shifts from a standard crime scene investigation to a profound moral dilemma. This case forces a terrifying examination of a legal system that failed to contain a monster, leaving a desperate father to answer the ultimate question: at what point does the law end and the primal duty to protect one's child begin? Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. To understand the tragedy that unfolded on a lonely stretch of road in Lonoke County, Arkansas, one must first dismantle the comfortable illusion of the stranger in the dark. The monster that haunts parental nightmares is rarely a shadow lurking in an alleyway. More often, it is a familiar face sitting at the dinner table, a voice singing in the church choir, a hand shaken on Sunday mornings. In the case of Aaron Spencer and his family, the threat did not break in through a window. It was invited in through the front door, welcomed with the warmth and trust that defines close-knit rural communities. This is the story of Michael Fosler, a man who wore the mask of a benevolent elder and family friend, while systematically dismantling the innocence of a child. Aaron Spencer was a man who defined himself by his capacity to protect. A hard-working father and husband, he had built a life in Cabot, Arkansas, grounded in the bedrock of traditional values, faith, family, and hard work. The Spencers were not isolated. They were part of a community fabric that relied on mutual trust. It was within this fabric that Michael Fosler operated. At 67 years old, Fosler presented a non-threatening, almost grandfatherly figure. He was a neighbor, a man who lived within the Spencer family's orbit, and crucially, a man who professed a deep, abiding Christian faith. In a community where shared religious belief often serves as a shorthand for character vetting, Fosler's outward piety acted as an unimpeachable credential. The relationship began innocuously, as these things always do. Fosler was not merely a neighbor. He positioned himself as a mentor and a confidant. He was the wolf in sheep's clothing, in the most biblical and literal sense. To Aaron and his wife Katie, Fosler was a helpful friend, someone who could be relied upon for favors, who took an interest in their lives, and who seemed to care genuinely for their well-being. This is the first stage of the grooming process, often overlooked in forensic autopsies of such cases: the grooming of the guardians. Before a predator can access the child, they must anesthetize the suspicions of the parents. Fosler achieved this by embedding himself in the Spencers' daily routine, normalizing his presence until he was no longer a guest, but a fixture. With the parents' trust secured, Fosler turned his attention to Aaron Spencer's daughter. The girl, a teenager navigating the complex, often tumultuous years of adolescence, became the target of a psychological siege that was invisible to those watching from the outside. Fossler did not begin with overt abuse. He began with validation. He utilized the classic predator script, identifying the natural insecurities of a young girl and offering himself as the sole solution. He listened when she felt unheard. He offered praise when she felt invisible. He constructed a private world where he was the only adult who truly understood her, creating a wedge between the daughter and her parents. This phase of the grooming was marked by clinical precision. Fossler leveraged his age and status to create a dynamic of specialness. He gave her gifts, small at first, then increasingly significant, always accompanied by the thrill of secrecy. The secrecy is the glue that binds the victim to the abuser. By convincing the teenager that their friendship was something the outside world, specifically her parents, would not understand or would try to destroy, he forced her into a conspiracy of silence. Every secret text message, every hushed conversation, every undeclared meeting served to isolate her further from Aaron and Katie Spencer. The manipulation was not merely emotional, it was spiritual. Fossler, utilizing his persona as a godly man, twisted religious concepts to justify the crossing of boundaries. This form of spiritual abuse is particularly insidious, as it frames the abuse not as a violation, but as a divine connection or a special destiny. It disarms the victim's moral alarm bells by cloaking the predator's desires in the language of faith. For a young girl raised in the church, challenging a man who spoke with the authority of a spiritual elder was psychologically nearly impossible. As the months turned into years, the relationship darkened. The friendship transitioned into sexual abuse, a horrifying escalation that occurred right under the noses of a vigilant family. This is the source of the profound guilt and rage that would later consume Aaron Spencer. It was not that he was negligent, it was that the predator was a master of camouflage. Fossler used technology to bypass parental safeguards, utilizing burner phones and hidden apps to maintain a constant digital tether to the girl. He tracked her, monitored her, and monopolized her attention, demanding absolute loyalty. The psychological toll on the victim was devastating. Fossler employed fear alongside affection. He threatened self-harm if she ever tried to leave him or expose the truth. He told her that he would die without her, placing the burden of his life on the shoulders of a child. This manipulation, threatening suicide to control a victim, is a hallmark of coercive control. It trapped the girl in a cycle of guilt and terror. She believed she was responsible for his survival, a heavy chain that kept her bound to a man nearly 4 times her age. For Aaron Spencer, the realization of what was happening was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, sickening unraveling. There were signs, changes in his daughter's demeanor, a withdrawal from family activities, a sudden secretiveness. But the context was missing. When the truth finally broke the surface, it shattered the Spencer family's reality. The discovery that Uncle Mike, the trusted neighbor, the pious churchgoer, had been sexually abusing their daughter was a trauma that defies articulation. It was a betrayal of the fundamental social contract. The Spencers did what responsible citizens are supposed to do. They went to the authorities. They placed their faith in the justice system to protect their child from the monster they had unmasked. The legal machinery began to turn. Michael Fossler was arrested. He was charged with sexual assault. The facts were laid bare, and the community reeled from the revelation of the darkness residing in their midst. But the arrest was not the end of the threat. It was merely a shift in the battlefield. The judicial system, designed to presume innocence until proven guilt, allowed Fosler to be released on bond. He was fitted with an ankle monitor, a digital shackle intended to ensure he stayed away from the victim. However, for a man like Fosler, obsessed and desperate to maintain control over his victim, a court order was nothing more than paper, and an ankle monitor was a hurdle to be circumvented. The no-contact order was absolute in theory, but porous in reality. Despite the charges, despite the looming trial, Fosler did not retreat. He continued to stalk the family. The grooming had evolved into obsession. He found ways to communicate, to signal his presence, to remind the girl and her family that he was still there, still watching. The psychological warfare intensified. Aaron Spencer found himself living in a state of hypervigilance. His home, once a sanctuary, had become a fortress under siege. He slept with one eye open, acutely aware that the man who had violated his daughter was free, living nearby, and refusing to let go. The failure of the system to contain Fosler is a critical component of this tragedy. The Spencers did everything right. They reported the crime. They cooperated with investigators. They secured the restraining orders. Yet, the danger remained acute. Fosler's release on bond sent a terrifying message. The law could name the predator, but it could not effectively stop him. The burden of protection fell back onto the father. Aaron Spencer was forced to watch as the legal process dragged on, while the threat to his daughter remained imminent and escalating. It is crucial to understand the mindset of Michael Fosler in the days leading up to the final confrontation. He was not a man repentant for his crimes. He was a man enraged by the loss of control. Predatory groomers often view their victims as property. The intervention of the parents and the police is seen not as justice, but as theft. Fosler felt entitled to the girl. His actions suggest he believed he could outsmart the system, outmaneuver the father, and reclaim his prize. He was emboldened by his release, interpreting his freedom on bond as a tactical victory. The tension in the Spencer household was palpable. Every car passing slowly down their road was a potential threat. Every notification on a phone was a potential breach. The trauma of the abuse was compounded by the ongoing terror of the stalker. The daughter was not allowed to heal. She was trapped in a suspended state of fear, knowing her abuser was walking the same streets, breathing the same air, plotting his return. This was the pressure cooker in which Aaron Spencer existed. He was a father watching his child disintegrate under the shadow of a man the law had failed to cage. The betrayal of the friendship had turned into a primal struggle for survival. The wolf in sheep's clothing had shed the disguise. Fosler was no longer pretending to be the benevolent neighbor. He was the hunter, open and brazen. The background of this case is not merely a list of dates and legal filings. It is a study in the pathology of grooming and the systemic failures that leave victims vulnerable even after the crime is exposed. Michael Fosler had spent years constructing a web of dependency and fear. He had infiltrated the Spencer family, weaponized their trust, and cannibalized the innocence of their child. When he was finally caught, he did not stop. He escalated. The stage was set for a collision that felt inevitable. On one side, a father pushed to the brink, driven by the biological imperative to protect his offspring from a clear and present danger. On the other, a predator who refused to accept boundaries, emboldened by a sense of entitlement and a legal system that granted him freedom despite the gravity of his crimes. The history of the Spencer family and Michael Fosler is a testament to the terrifying reality that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our homes and that sometimes the only barrier between a child and their destroyer is the will of a parent who has nothing left to lose. This was the volatile atmosphere that hung over Cabot, Arkansas, as the clock ticked down toward the moment where the legal battle would end and the physical confrontation would begin. The morning of July 17, 2017, broke over Hot Springs, Arkansas, with the oppressive humidity typical of the region. But inside the Spencer residence, the atmosphere was already suffocating. It was a silence that carried weight. For Aaron and Katie Spencer, sleep had been a commodity in short supply for months. Their lives had been commandeered by a singular, looming threat named Michael Fosler. Fosler was 67 years old, a family friend turned predator who had been charged with the sexual assault of the Spencers' 14-year-old daughter, despite the gravity of the charges and the devastating trauma inflicted upon the family. Fosler was not behind bars. He was free on bond, walking the same streets, breathing the same air, protected by the procedural delays of the legal system, and a piece of paper mandating a no-contact order. The clock read just past 1 in the morning when the nightmare resumed. The sequence of events that would end in gunfire began with a ritual that had become grimly routine for the parents, checking on their daughter. The door to her bedroom was opened, expecting the rhythmic breathing of a sleeping teenager. Instead, they found the stillness of an empty room. The bed was unmade. The window was open. The screen had been removed. For Aaron Spencer, the visual data processed into an immediate, visceral conclusion. She was gone, and there was only one person would have taken her. The panic that ensued was not the chaotic flailing of the unprepared, but the cold, adrenaline-fueled mobilization of parents who had been anticipating the worst. They immediately dialed 911. The call, recorded in the archives of the Garland County Dispatch, captures the frantic desperation of a mother and father realizing the system had failed them again. They told the police that Michael Fosler had taken her. They explained the history, the rape charges, the bond conditions, the no-contact order. They pleaded for an immediate manhunt. However, the response they received felt sluggish, bound by protocol and jurisdiction. To the parents, every second of administrative delay was a second their daughter was in the hands of her abuser. Aaron Spencer realized that waiting for law enforcement to navigate their procedures might cost his daughter her life. He turned to technology. The family had installed tracking software on the daughter's cell phone, a digital tether meant for exactly this scenario. Aaron pulled up the application. The map of Hot Springs loaded, the grid of streets and highways illuminating the screen. A small blue dot appeared. It was moving. The signal was active. She was not just missing, she was traveling. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Aaron and Katie Spencer made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They did not wait for a squad car. They climbed into Aaron's Dodge Ram pickup truck. The engine roared to life, shattering the suburban quiet. Aaron took the wheel, Katie in the passenger seat, clutching the phone. Her eyes locked on the moving blue dot. They were no longer just parents. They were hunters tracking a predator who had stolen their child. The vehicle reversed out of the driveway and tore onto the main road. The hunt had begun. The digital signal indicated that Fosler was not stationary. He was driving, likely attempting to take the 14-year-old out of the county or perhaps the state. The pursuit led them through the winding, dark roads of Garland County. The darkness of the early morning made visibility poor, the hue streetlights flickering past as Aaron pushed the truck's engine. The speedometer climbed. Every turn was dictated by the phone in Katie's hand. She relayed directions, her voice tight with fear. "Turn left. He's heading south. He's stopped. No, he's moving again." For miles, they were ghosts chasing a ghost. They could see the location on the map, but the physical vehicle remained elusive. The psychological toll of the chase was immense. Aaron knew that Fosler was a manipulator who had groomed his daughter, twisting her perception of reality. If Fosler realized he was being tracked, the situation could escalate instantly. The fear was not just of abduction, but of a murder-suicide. As dawn began to approach, the chase intensified. The blue dot led them toward the intersection of Highway 7 and Highway 290. The traffic was light, the roads opening up, and then visual confirmation. Ahead of them, Aaron spotted the vehicle. It was Michael Fosler's car. The recognition was as instantaneous. The abstraction of the digital signal solidified into the metal and glass reality of the abuser's sedan. Inside that car was the daughter Aaron had spent his life protecting, now sitting beside the man who had violated her. Aaron accelerated. The Dodge Ram, heavier and more powerful, closed the distance. Fosler, looking in his rearview mirror, realized he had been found. The dynamic on the road shifted from a stealthy track to a high-speed pursuit. Fosler punched the gas, his sedan swerving as he attempted to lose the truck. The vehicles tore through the morning light, engines screaming. The legal speed limits ceased to exist. They were operating on the laws of survival. The chase wove through traffic, endangering anyone else on the road. But Aaron's focus was singular. He could not let that car disappear. If Fosler managed to outrun them, if he made it to a highway ramp or a hidden turnoff, the daughter might never be seen again. The desperate father pushed the truck harder, the grille of the Ram looming large in Fosler's rear window. The gap narrowed. 10 car lengths. 5, 2. They were approaching a busier section of the road near an intersection. The risks were compounding. Aaron made a tactical calculation. He could not simply follow Fosler until the police arrived. The police were minutes behind, perhaps miles away. He had to stop the vehicle. He had to immobilize the threat. The precise mechanics of the collision were violent and deliberate. As the vehicles maneuvered near the intersection, Aaron used his truck to intercept Fosler's sedan. It was a move born of desperation, a civilian's attempt at a pit maneuver. The sound of metal shearing against metal erupted as the truck collided with the car. The force of the impact was tremendous. Glass shattered. Tires screeched across the asphalt, leaving black scars on the road. The sedan spun, control lost, and came to a violent halt, pinned or disabled by the crash. The dust and debris settled in the sudden silence that follows a wreck. It was now approximately 8 a.m. The scene froze for a microsecond. The sedan was stopped. The truck was stopped. But the threat was still active. Aaron Spencer threw open the driver's side door of his truck. He stepped out onto the pavement. His heart was hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He was not empty-handed. In his grip was a firearm. He had brought the weapon because he knew who Michael Fosler was. He knew Fosler was awaiting trial for a sexual felony. He knew the man had disregarded a court order to kidnap a child. Aaron did not know if Fosler was armed, but he knew Fosler was dangerous. Aaron moved toward the sedan. The distance was short, just a few yards of asphalt separating a father from his daughter's captor. Through the windows of the wrecked sedan, the scene inside was chaotic. The airbags may have deployed. The daughter was there, visibly shaken, terrified, trapped in the passenger seat of a car driven by her rapist. And there was Fosler. The confrontation was brief. There were no lengthy speeches, no cinematic dialogue. It was a collision of primal forces. Aaron approached the vehicle, shouting commands, his focus splitting between checking his daughter's status and watching Fosler's hands. Fosler, cornered and desperate, was still in the driver's seat. According to the accounts that would later be dissected by investigators and prosecutors, Aaron perceived an immediate, lethal threat. The man who had already destroyed the family's peace, who had violated the sanctity of their home and the body of their child, was now a cornered animal. Aaron raised his weapon. The shots rang out. They were loud, cracking reports that echoed off the nearby buildings and the pavement of the intersection. Aaron fired multiple times. The bullets pierced the vehicle, shattering the remaining glass, and struck Michael Fosler. The clinical reality of the trauma was immediate. The rounds compromised vital organs, ending the threat with brutal efficiency. Fosler slumped in the seat, his control over the daughter and the situation terminated instantly. The shooting stopped. The echo faded. Aaron Spencer stood there, the gun still in his hand, the smoke dissipating. He did not run. He did not try to hide the weapon. He did not flee the scene. He lowered the gun and looked at the carnage, then at his daughter. She was alive. She was physically present. The abduction was over. Katie Spencer was there, rushing to the vehicle to extract their child. The reunion was frantic, a blur of tears and checking for injuries, pulling the 14-year-old from the wreckage of the abuser's car. They held her, the family unit physically reunited in the shadow of a homicide. Police sirens, distant at first, began to swell in volume, closing in from multiple directions. The 911 calls from witnesses at the intersection had flooded the dispatch. Reports of a high-speed crash followed by gunfire brought a swarm of law enforcement. When the first cruisers arrived, tires squealing as they boxed in the scene, they found a tableau of devastation and surrender. The smashed vehicles blocked the road. Michael Fosler lay dead in the driver's seat of his sedan, and Aaron Spencer was waiting for them. He complied immediately with police commands. He placed the weapon on the ground. He raised his hands. He did not resist. He got down on the pavement, the hot asphalt pressing against him. As the officers advanced, weapons drawn, shouting for him to stay down, Aaron remained calm. He had done what he set out to do. He had retrieved his daughter. The cost of that retrieval was the life of Michael Fosler and his own freedom. But in that moment, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the arithmetic seemed to balance. The officers secured the scene. Crime scene tape was unspooled, fluttering in the hot breeze. Paramedics arrived, but there was nothing to be done for Fosler. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner would later detail the trajectory of the bullets, the clinical cause of death, cataloguing the end of a man who had terrorized a family. Meanwhile, the daughter was ushered away from the gruesome sight, attended to by emergency responders and her mother. The trauma of the abduction, the crash, and the shooting would require years to unpack, but the immediate physical danger had been neutralized. Aaron was hoisted from the ground and led to the back of a police cruiser. He sat in the hard plastic seat, watching through the caged window as investigators began to mark evidence cones around the shell casings he had just ejected. The flashing blue and red lights washed over his face. He was no longer just a father. He was now a suspect in a homicide investigation. The detectives would ask him why he didn't wait for the police. They would ask why he pulled the trigger. They would analyze the legality of self-defense and defense of another. But in the silence of the squad car, as the adrenaline began to crash and the reality of the legal storm ahead began to form, the narrative for Aaron was simple. He had woken up to an empty bed. He had tracked the signal. He had chased the monster, and he had stopped him. The events of that morning, spanning from the 1 a.m. discovery to the 8 a.m. shooting, had lasted only 7 hours. Yet, those 7 hours had dismantled the legal framework of the case. There would be no trial for Michael Fosler. There would be no testimony from the daughter against her abuser in a court of law. The justice system, which Aaron felt had moved too slowly to protect his child, had been bypassed entirely by a father with a truck and a gun. As the tow trucks arrived to separate the entangled vehicles, the physical scars of the event were cleared away. The glass was swept up. The fluids were washed from the road. Traffic was eventually allowed to flow again. But the story was far from over. The death of Michael Fosler was the end of the abduction, but it was the beginning of the Aaron Spencer case. The prosecutor now faced a dilemma that would divide the community and challenge the definitions of justice. Do you charge a father for murder when he kills the man kidnapping his daughter? The reconstruction of the timeline showed a clear chain of custody regarding the danger. Fosler initiated the crime by violating the bond and taking the girl. He escalated the danger by fleeing, but the final act, the decision to fire, belonged to Aaron. The minute-by-minute log of the chase provided the context, proving that this was not a premeditated execution in cold blood, but the culmination of a frantic, high-stakes rescue mission where the margin for error was zero. Inside the police station, Aaron was processed. Fingerprints, mugshot. The clinical bureaucracy of the booking process stood in stark contrast to the raw emotion of the morning. He was stripped of his personal effects. His shoelaces were removed. He was placed in a holding cell. The man who had saved his daughter was now behind bars, while the man who had taken her was in the morgue. The community reaction began to bubble almost immediately as news of the shooting spread. In Hot Springs, the details of the Fosler name were known. The Whisper Network had already branded him a predator. When the news broke that Aaron Spencer had killed him, the public narrative did not favor the deceased. However, the law is not written in the court of public opinion. The investigators had to look at the angles of the shots, the distance between the men, and the statements provided. The crucial question remained: at the exact moment Aaron pulled the trigger, did he reasonably believe his daughter or himself was in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm? The defense would later argue that Fosler's use of the vehicle as a weapon, his history of sexual violence, and the act of kidnapping itself constituted a continuous lethal threat. The prosecution would have to weigh whether the crash had neutralized that threat before the shots were fired. Back at the scene, the sun climbed higher, baking the asphalt. The day went on, but for the Spencer family, time had fractured. There was the life before the chase and the life after. The memory of the high-speed pursuit, the roar of the engine, the sickening crunch of the impact, and the finality of the gunshots would replay in their minds with the same high-definition clarity as the security footage that would later be shown on the news. The chase was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The silence that descended upon the rural stretch of road in Judsonia, Arkansas, following the report of a firearm was absolute, broken only by the approaching wail of sirens that would define the next chapter of Aaron Spencer's life. When deputies from the White County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene, they encountered a tableau that blurred the lines between a crime scene and a rescue operation. Michael Gibbs, the 31-year-old man who had been discovered in a vehicle with Spencer's 14-year-old daughter, lay dead. The chaotic adrenaline-fueled vehicle chase that had careened through the darkened streets had ended in a collision and a subsequent shooting. For the law enforcement officers present, the visual evidence presented a binary reality. There was a body, there was a shooter, and there was a weapon. While the moral underpinnings of the event were complex, the statutory violation appeared clear. Aaron Spencer was taken into custody, the metal cuffs securing his wrists, marking the transition from a desperate father to a criminal defendant. The initial charge leveled against Spencer was first-degree murder. Under Arkansas law, this classification implies a purposeful act, a killing committed with premeditation and deliberation. The prosecution, led by the roadmap of the Penal Code, looked at the mechanics of the event. Spencer had pursued Gibbs. He had engaged in a high-speed chase. When the vehicle stopped, he had discharged a weapon resulting in the death of the driver. In the cold, fluorescent light of the interrogation room and the subsequent filing of the affidavit, the context of the daughter's abuse was a mitigating factor, but not an immediate absolution for the act of taking a human life. The state argued that the threat had been neutralized when the cars crashed, and the subsequent shooting was an act of vengeance rather than immediate defense. This legal interpretation set the stage for a potential sentence of life in prison, or worse, creating a terrifying paradox where a man who believed he had saved his child was now facing the prospect of never seeing her again. As the news of the arrest and the severity of the charge rippled outward from White County, it collided with a public sentiment that operated on an entirely different frequency than the judicial system. The community reaction was immediate, visceral, and overwhelming. To the residents of Judsonia and the thousands of observers tracking the story online, Aaron Spencer was not a murderer. He was a symbol of parental duty pushed to its absolute limit. The narrative of Michael Gibbs, a 31-year-old man soliciting a 14-year-old girl, stripped the deceased of public sympathy. The moral code of the community dictated that a predator had met a natural consequence of his actions, and the father who delivered that consequence was being punished for doing what any loving parent would theoretically wish to do. This dissonance between the law and the public conscience manifested in a massive groundswell of support. A fundraising campaign was established to cover Spencer's legal fees, the total climbing rapidly as donations poured in from strangers who saw themselves in Aaron's position. The Free Aaron Spencer movement was not merely a hashtag, it was a societal rejection of the state's narrative. Comments on news articles and social media platforms were vitriolic toward the prosecution, demanding the charges be dropped entirely. The defense team, keenly aware of this atmosphere, understood that while the law was rigid, the jury pool was drawn from this very community. Trying a father for killing his daughter's abuser in a conservative Arkansas county presented an insurmountable challenge for the prosecution. The likelihood of jury nullification, where jurors knowingly reject the law to acquit a defendant they believe acted morally, loomed large over the proceedings. However, the legal machinery could not simply ignore the body of Michael Gibbs. To dismiss the charges entirely would establish a legal precedent that condoned vigilante justice, effectively suggesting that the discovery of a crime authorizes a civilian to execute the perpetrator. The prosecutor, T. Cameron McCaslin, was tasked with threading a needle between enforcing the rule of law and acknowledging the extraordinary provocation that led to the shooting. The first-degree murder charge, while legally supportable by the physical actions taken, was practically unenforceable in the court of public opinion. The defense argued that Spencer's actions were not the cold calculations of a murderer, but the frantic, protective response of a father under extreme emotional distress, acting to prevent the kidnapping and further abuse of his child. Behind closed doors, the negotiations began. The defense leverage was the sympathetic nature of the defendant. The prosecution's leverage was the undeniable fact of the homicide and the risk of a life sentence if a jury decided to follow the strict letter of the law. The conversation shifted from murder to manslaughter. Manslaughter in Arkansas applies when a person causes the death of another under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance for which there is reasonable excuse. The situation Aaron Spencer found himself in, discovering his teenage daughter in the clutches of an adult predator, fit the clinical definition of extreme emotional disturbance perfectly. It acknowledged the killing was unlawful, but conceded that the human capacity for reason had been shattered by the trauma of the moment. The plea deal negotiation was a calculated forensic accounting of justice. The state needed a conviction to uphold the prohibition against extrajudicial killing. Spencer needed a guarantee that he would not die in prison. The initial first-degree murder charge was formally withdrawn, replaced by a charge of manslaughter. This reduction was massive, acknowledging the context of the abuse without fully exonerating the lethal response. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the strict abolitionists of violence nor the absolute defenders of the father, but it was the only path that aligned with the realities of the courtroom. On the day of the sentencing in February 2024, the atmosphere in the White County Circuit Court was heavy with the gravity of the compromise. Aaron Spencer stood before the bench, the physical embodiment of the tragic cost of the entire affair. He was no longer the adrenaline-fueled protector in the truck. He was a man exhausted by the weight of his actions and the looming separation from his family. The plea agreement was presented to the judge. Spencer pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The admission was a legal necessity, a verbal confirmation that he had recklessly caused the death of Michael Gibbs. It was a sterile recitation of facts that barely scratched the surface of the emotional magma beneath. The sentence handed down was 8 years in the Arkansas Department of Correction. The number struck the courtroom with a hollow thud. 8 years. To the prosecution, it was a significant prison term that validated the sanctity of life and punished the taking of it. It sent a message that vigilantism would result in the loss of liberty. To the supporters of Spencer, it was a travesty, a punishment for a man who had already suffered the victimization of his child. To Aaron Spencer, it was a countdown. It was a quantifiable measure of time he would be absent from his daughter's life, the very life he had destroyed his own to protect. The mechanics of the sentencing hearing were swift and procedural, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that birthed the case. The judge accepted the plea. The paperwork was stamped. The custody transfer was initiated. There were no grand speeches that could reconcile the two opposing truths of the case: that Michael Gibbs had preyed upon a child, and that Aaron Spencer had killed him for it. The courtroom operated on the logic of statutes and sentencing guidelines, indifferent to the moral outrage that churned outside its doors. As Spencer was processed for transport to the Department of Correction, the reality of the 8-year sentence began to settle. In the clinical assessment of the criminal justice system, justice had been served. A homicide was punished. A plea was secured. The court docket was cleared. Yet, the tragedy remained open-ended. The daughter, the primary victim of Michael Gibbs's grooming and abuse, was left to navigate her trauma, not only without the closure of a trial, but with the added burden of her father's incarceration. The father, who had acted on the most primal instinct of the human species, was stripped of his autonomy and placed in a cell, surrounded by men whose crimes lacked the moral grey area of his own. The Aaron Spencer case, concluding with a plea to manslaughter, exposed the friction points in the American legal system. It demonstrated that the law is a blunt instrument, capable of measuring actions and intent, but often incapable of measuring the depth of human anguish. The 8-year sentence was a mathematical average between life in prison and total exoneration. Some legal calculation designed to balance the books. But as the transport van carried Aaron Spencer away from Judsonia, leaving behind the shattered remnants of 2 families, the community was left with a lingering, uncomfortable silence. The law had spoken, but the moral question remained unanswered, hanging in the air like the smoke from a gunshot that refuses to dissipate. The father had stopped the abuser, but the system had stopped the father, leaving the concept of justice suspended somewhere in the heartbreaking distance between them. The smoke cleared on the frantic roadside scene in Lonoke County, leaving behind a tableau of shattered glass, a wrecked vehicle, and the body of 67-year-old Michael Fosler. While the immediate violence had ceased, the reverberations of that gunshot were only beginning to propagate through the legal and social structures of Arkansas. The death of Michael Fosler at the hands of Aaron Spencer was not merely the conclusion of a kidnapping attempt. It was the violent punctuation mark on a sentence the judicial system had failed to write. As the police tape was wound up and the investigators catalogued the shell casings, the narrative shifted from the asphalt to the courthouse, exposing a catastrophic failure of institutional oversight that forced a father to become the final arbiter of his daughter's safety. To understand why Aaron Spencer felt compelled to ram his vehicle into his daughter's abductor and open fire, one must autopsy the procedural failures that allowed Michael Fosler to be on the street in the first place. This was not a random abduction by a stranger in the night. Fosler was a known entity, a man whose predatory behaviors had been documented, charged, and theoretically contained by the state. Months prior to the fatal confrontation, Fosler had been arrested and charged with the rape of Spencer's teenage daughter. The allegations were severe, detailing a pattern of grooming and sexual abuse that would typically demand the highest level of custodial caution. Yet, the mechanism of the court operated with a detached, bureaucratic inertia. Fosler was released on a $50,000 bond, a sum that many in the community later decried as insultingly low, given the gravity of the charges and the vulnerability of the victim. The conditions of his release were standard on paper, but fatal in practice. He was ordered to have no contact with the victim, and was fitted with an ankle monitor. In the sterile logic of the courtroom, these measures were deemed sufficient. In the chaotic reality of a predator's obsession, they were negligible inconveniences. The ankle monitor, intended to be an electronic leash, became a symbol of the system's technological complacency. On the night of the abduction, Fosler violated the geofencing constraints. He moved toward the Spencer home, breached the perimeter, and successfully lured the girl out. The monitoring service, which operates on data, points and ping rates, failed to trigger an immediate, actionable law enforcement response that could have intercepted Fosler before he put the girl in his car. The delay between the digital violation and human intervention created a window of opportunity wide enough for a kidnapping. This gap in the safety net meant that the only thing standing between the teenager and her abuser was not the state, not the police, and not the court order, but the vigilance of her father. The revelation of Fosler's criminal history and the failure of the bond system ignited a firestorm of public scrutiny. The community in Lonoke County and indeed observers across the nation, were forced to reckon with the disturbing calculus of the bail system. The argument was no longer about the presumption of innocence, but about the assessment of risk. Fosler had demonstrated a predatory fixation. By allowing him to return to the community, even with electronic monitoring, the court had essentially wagered the child's safety against the efficacy of a GPS signal. The wager was lost. The release of Fosler validated the deepest fears of victims' rights advocates, that the judicial process is often too slow and too reactive to protect victims from obsessive offenders. Aaron Spencer did not act in a vacuum. He acted in the void left by a system that had catalogued the danger but failed to neutralize it. While the legal analyst dissected the bond hearing, a much quieter and more profound tragedy was unfolding within the Spencer household. The legacy of this case is most acutely felt in the psychological aftermath for Spencer's daughter. She is the survivor of a double trauma: the long-term grooming and abuse by Fosler, and the acute, violent termination of that relationship, witnessing her father kill him. The clinical reality of grooming is that it rewires the victim's perception of trust and affection. Fosler had spent months, perhaps longer, infiltrating her world, isolating her from her parents, and positioning himself as her confidant. This psychological manipulation does not vanish simply because the manipulator is dead. Trauma experts note that for a victim in this position, the death of the abuser can result in a complex grief, entangled with relief, guilt, and confusion. The daughter was not merely a passive object in the abduction. She was a victim of coercion who had been psychologically conditioned to go with him. The sight of her father ramming the car and shooting Fosler shattered the world as she knew it. She saw her protector become a killer to save her. The burden of that knowledge is immense. She must navigate her adolescence carrying the weight of the fact that her abuse resulted in a homicide. The Spencer family, including Aaron and his wife Julie, have been thrust into the difficult role of rebuilding a psyche that was systematically dismantled by an adult predator. They have to explain to a child that the man who claimed to love her was a monster, and that the system designed to keep her safe was asleep at the wheel. The healing process is not linear. It is a minefield of triggers, from the sound of a car engine to the sight of police uniforms. The legal resolution for Aaron Spencer provided a form of closure, but it also highlighted the stark difference between legality and justice. Lonoke County prosecuting attorney Matt Durrett reviewed the investigation file with clinical objectivity. The facts were clear. Fosler was committing a felony kidnapping. He was in violation of a no-contact order, and the father had a reasonable belief that his daughter faced imminent death or serious physical injury. Under Arkansas law, the use of deadly force was justified. Durrett announced that no charges would be filed against Aaron Spencer. In the eyes of the law, Spencer was cleared. He was a father protecting his child. However, this exoneration sparked a contentious public debate that continues to simmer. To the vast majority of the public, Aaron Spencer is an unassailable hero, an archetype of paternal duty who did what any father would hope to have the courage to do. Social media platforms and local town halls were flooded with support, framing the shooting as the ultimate form of justice, visceral, immediate, and final. But beneath the praise lies a disquieting implication. If Aaron Spencer is a hero, it is only because the state was a failure. The glorification of his actions carries with it a condemnation of the civil order. We celebrate the father with the gun because we have lost faith in the judge with the gavel. Legal scholars and ethicists point out the danger of normalizing this outcome. The vigilante label is often rejected by Spencer's supporters, who prefer the term protector, but the mechanics of the act, a civilian pursuing a suspect, engaging in a high-speed vehicle collision, and executing a shooting, are the definition of extrajudicial enforcement. The debate centers on whether justice was truly served. Justice, in a constitutional democracy, is a process. It involves trial, conviction, and sentencing. Michael Fossler received none of these. He received a bullet. While few mourn Fossler, the precedent is unsettling. The case suggests that in the face of bureaucratic incompetence, the citizen is forced to revert to a state of nature where survival depends on firepower and aggression. This sentiment has catalyzed a legislative push, spearheaded by the Spencer family and their supporters, to reform the bail laws in Arkansas. The proposed changes, often discussed under the moniker of Aaron's Law or similar victim protection initiatives, seek to make it far more difficult for individuals charged with sexual offenses against minors to obtain bond. The logic is simple. If the system cannot guarantee the monitoring of a predator, it should not release him. The legacy of the Aaron Spencer case is thus being written in the committee rooms of the state capitol, where lawmakers are attempting to plug the holes that allowed Fossler to slip through. They are trying to ensure that no other father is placed in the cockpit of a truck, chasing a kidnapper down a dark highway, weighing the life of a man against the life of his child. The narrative of the Aaron Spencer case is often reduced to a headline about a vengeful dad, but the body of the story is an indictment of systemic complacency. The judicial system treated Michael Fossler as a standard criminal defendant, processing him through the bond schedule and assigning him a tracker, ignoring the specific obsessive pathology of a child groomer. They applied a generic template to a unique threat. The result was a collision of inevitable violence. For the Spencer family, the justified ruling by the prosecutor was the end of the legal jeopardy, but the beginning of a lifetime of processing. Aaron Spencer must live with the memory of taking a human life, a gravity that is not negated by the righteousness of the cause. He is not a killer by trade or inclination. He was drafted into that role by necessity. His daughter must grow up in the shadow of this event, her personal trauma publicly litigated and discussed by strangers. And the community is left with the uncomfortable knowledge that their safety nets are full of holes. In the final analysis of Chapter 4, the legacy of this case is a mirror held up to the broken machinery of the courts. It reveals a system that prizes procedure over protection. It shows us that a restraining order is only as strong as the paper it is printed on, and an ankle monitor is only as effective as the human being watching the screen. Michael Fossler is dead, and Aaron Spencer is free, but the word justice feels inadequate to describe the wreckage left behind. True justice would have been a system that kept Fossler behind bars in July, leaving Aaron Spencer to be nothing more than a father, and his daughter to be nothing more than a child. Instead, the failure of the state created a tragedy where the only available resolution was found in the chamber of a gun. The lasting echo of the Aaron Spencer case is not the sound of the shot, but the silence of the system that preceded it, a silence that compelled a father to speak in the only language the predator would understand. The final echo of the gavel in the Lonoke County Courthouse did more than impose an 8-year sentence for manslaughter. It codified the destruction of 2 lineages on a rural Arkansas roadside. The events of October 8, 2022, concluded with Michael Fossler dead from gunshot wounds and Aaron Spencer in shackles. Yet the forensic evidence captures only the mechanics of death, not the systemic failures that precipitated it. Legal experts characterizing the verdict note the jury's distinct struggle to reconcile the cold statutes of homicide with the visceral reality of a father discovering his 14-year-old daughter in the vehicle of her alleged rapist. The judicial apparatus had released Fosler on bond despite the severity of the initial sexual assault charges, creating a vacuum of protection that Spencer felt compelled to fill with lethal force. Residents of Cabot remain fractured, oscillating between sympathy for a desperate parent and fear of unchecked vigilantism. The tragedy leaves behind a distinct heavy stillness. One family grapples with the violent end of a son, while the Spencer household navigates a new hollow existence without their patriarch. Aaron Spencer now resides within the stark confines of the Arkansas Department of Correction, serving time for an act he framed as a rescue mission rather than a murder. He sits in a concrete cell, stripped of his autonomy, a living testament to the catastrophic intersection of parental love and the penal code. The narrative closes not on a resolution, but on the haunting paradox of a man who believed the only way to save his child's life was to forfeit his own liberty, forcing the audience to ask if true justice was ever an option in this equation.